Okay, hello everyone. I am talking about Edna Ann Proulx, better known as Annie Proulx, and her Pulitzer-winning novel, The Shipping News. So, I'm going to start with a bit of biographical information. However, it's important to note there's not a lot of information out there about Prue's early life. This is not because she's expressly prohibited biographies to be written about her, but more because she just doesn't share a lot about her early life. Um, when asked about her youth in a New York Times interview, she stated, "Not only is it boring and uninteresting, but it's nobody's business." So we have some snippets here and there that she's been willing to share, as well as some more easily discoverable information about, her education, career, things like that. But as far as actual biographies, I've found chapters, within other books written about multiple authors, and a chapter will be dedicated to an author, but nothing, fully dedicated to her, just because I think there's just not a lot to go off of. Um, so, anywho, maybe there will be more once she has passed away, but at this time, not a whole lot, but there are a lot of really great interviews, and that's where I got most of my information from. So, that said, she was born on August 22nd, 1935, in Norwich, Connecticut. Her father, George, was the vice president of a textile company where he actually began as a boy in the textile mill. So he rose, to the top of the company. So very successful man. She grew up in towns across New England and North Carolina. She with her parents moving around with them. She loved moving around. She still does today. She said that she doesn't like to remain in the same place for too long and likes to learn about new places. So she likes to move around. Her mother, Lois, was a painter, and she really admired her mother and credits her for teaching her how to see, she says. She explained in an interview that her mom would point out seemingly insignificant details to her everywhere they went, recalling, "From the time I was extremely small, I was told, 'Look at that.' Everything from the wail of the corduroy to the broken button to the loose thread to the disheveled mustache to the clouded eye. Most often it was anthills," she explains. Her mother would say, "Look at that one carrying a stick. All these guys had characters." She would give them voices. We'd be watching them and pointing out the various ones. There was Charlie, there was Mr. Jones. She had an animistic universe in her mind. So she says, her mother taught her to pay attention to detail, to the beauty in small things, and just to really appreciate little things. So she recalls in this New York Times interview that at age 10, sick in bed with chickenpox, she wrote her first short story. She doesn't remember what it was about, but she remembers that being the point at which she sort of discovered her love for writing. And she continued writing intermittently after that, but she got married at the age of 20 for the first time and shortly after became a mother. So after that, for a while, she just didn't have the time or money to continue writing regularly. So, a little bit more about her marriages and family life. She recalls in that same New York Times interview that she's been married and divorced, quote, "too many times." She's been married and divorced 3 times. After this first marriage, which she had her daughter, Sylvia, she married again and had 3 sons, Jonathan, Gillis, and Morgan. And then she divorces her second husband and marries for the third time in 1969. And she later divorces again and she lives alone now. But but rewinding just a few years, so before that, in 1966, at the age of 31 and after her second divorce, she began studying at the University of Vermont, graduating cum laude with a Bachelor of Arts in History in 1969. And in 1973, she earned her master's from Sir George Williams University, which is now Concordia University. And then, right immediately following, began pursuing a PhD before deciding to leave that program. And then she began to write full time. So you'll see in the timeline that her first works to be published were short stories in magazines, and then later a collection of short stories. But her first novel was actually not published until 1992 when she was 57. And then The Shipping News was published the following year when she was 58. So her success as far as novels go was very late in life. Um, and so the Shipping News won the National Book Award and the Irish Times International Fiction Prize the year that it was published, and then the Pulitzer the following year. And so I just wanted to talk a bit about her inspiration for the Shipping News, which she shared in this interview that I've gotten most of my information from. That was just super interesting. So she explains that she doesn't write about what she already knows. She prefers to go somewhere she hasn't been and write about what she finds. So she decided to go with a friend to Newfoundland, having been intrigued by the place names, she said. Names like Joe Bat's Arm, Seldom Come By, Dead Man's Cove, Heart's Delight, and Annie Opscotch Mountains. So just sort of quirky names that I guess she saw in a magazine or um, I'm not sure where, but she saw these names, thought they were really inspiring, and decided to go to Newfoundland. So getting there took 3 days in her pickup truck and an 8-hour ferry ride. She says there was something about that hard bare rock, the whistling wind, I found very appealing. She said, I liked the loneliness and desolateness, the heavily wooded feeling of it. I felt clasped to that stony bosom in a way. I was physically shaken. It wasn't so much a rush of energy as a rush of empathy. So, as she was writing the Shipping News, she made 8 or 9 trips to Newfoundland, and she would camp or bunk in bed and breakfasts. And she hung out in kitchens and boatyards, listening and just sort of getting a feel for the place. And she said to find names for her, quote, oddball characters, such as Billy Pretty, Nutbeam, Turk Card, Beady Bucket, Wavy Prows. She said that she went through local telephone books and read bulletin boards around Newfoundland. And then, as for her sort of iconic dialect, um, she studied the Dictionary of Newfoundland English. So, very authentic. And I think that that was sort of the whole point. She wanted the book to feel very authentically um, Newfoundland, you know? And she explains that she learned of the cod fishing industry, which had sustained the island for its existence, and at the time was on the verge of collapse. And she said that's all anyone talked about. She said it was clear that something was very, very wrong and that Newfoundland seemed fated to lose its way of life. She explained that all of this is a part of the Shipping News and that she sort of intended it to be a literary message in a bottle to America, which she believed was once like Newfoundland. And so she documented how she saw life changing in Newfoundland and then how she, saw that it had already changed in the United States. So I just thought that was sort of an interesting um, road to the Shipping News, kind of how she got there and why. So that takes us to a good point to go to the publication. So in 1993, the Shipping News is published by Charles Scribner's Sons. The first printing was just under 20,000 copies. And then the following year, it was announced that the novel was going to win the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. And within a day of the announcement, Scribner's went back to press for 25,000 more copies. Ingram, just one of the country's largest distributors, requested 8,400 copies in the month after the prize announcement. Their previous request was about 100 each month, so quite a large request. And the book just immediately went out of stock. Scribner's couldn't print it quickly enough, and the demand was just so high for it immediately after that announcement. And then in 2001, I'll talk about this in a few more minutes in a little bit more detail, but in 2001, the novel was adapted to film, and it did not get very good reception, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So the reception of the novel, generally when it was first published, it was well received, with just some criticism of Proux's form and writing style. So I won't read you all of these, but I'll just read you some. So this is from the Voice Tribune in 1993. The Shipping News transcends sitcom and sociology to become a work of art That rare creation, a lyric page turner, the shipping news is about balance, love and hate, nature and people, work and play, old and young, the spirit and money, hope and despair. So that's just a positive one, give you an overview of that. And then this is one that just has a little bit of criticism towards her writing. From the New York Times in 1993, throughout the shipping news, the seriousness of Annie Proulx's prose seems to correspond physically with the texture of the weather and sea. Her inventive language is finely, if exhaustively, accomplished. If I have any complaint, it is that at times she carries her own brand of poetic compression too far. Billy's worn shape down to the bones casts Coil as a sliding mass. Whether offshore or overland, can often seem chokingly imbued with portentousness. Near the novel's end, Jack Bucket sits up in his own coffin, spouting water, having both drowned and not drowned. It's a forced invention in a novel otherwise replete with wonderfully natural ones. So, mostly positive with just some criticism here and there. And then post Pulitzer Prize, as far as criticism, not much, changes. Still mostly popular and positive, just with some criticism, mostly about her writing style. But as far as popularity and sales, the novel is doing extremely well. So let's see. I won't read you all of those, but you can take some time to read those. And then currently, the novel hasn't been entirely forgotten, but just not much is being said about it. It is, let's see, it's more than 20 years old now, and it's just not being talked about as much. But what is said is generally positive. I found this, it's just from a blog post in 2016. Like I said, there's just not much being said about it right now. But this says, almost a reverse coming of age, there was something calming and redeeming about spending an afternoon with the shipping news. Looking through the eyes of a middle-aged man who sees the hardness of life and just tries to make the best of it. It's not exactly a beach read, but you'll be glad you spent your time with Coil in his town, leaving much fuller than when you arrived. So just a nice little wholesome review right there. And then as far as the film, the reception to that was very poor. This is a review from December of 2001, and I guess I'll just read the whole thing because it's kind of funny. It's a given that a book as eccentric, poetic, and individual as Proulx could never be accurately reproduced on the screen, as Hallstrom, who produced the movie, said in an interview. The novel was almost provokingly undramatic. But is that any reason for a film so standard that it's hard to believe the book won so much as a prize in a Cracker Jack box? The result of casting Kevin Spacey is a self-conscious performance that turns Coil into a pathetic individual who's difficult to care about. Someone who more than lives up to the poetic jibe a co-worker throws at him. You don't have the sense God gave a donut. More critically, it's a portrayal so unconvincing it makes it close to impossible for the rest of the film to function as intended. So everyone hates the film. I haven't seen it, but I believe that it's probably pretty bad. So just a little plot overview. It's kind of difficult to sum up a novel in one paragraph, and I mean, you guys all read it, so you know what it's about, but this is just a really brief little synopsis that I wrote. Coil, the novel's protagonist, is a newspaper reporter who decided to begin life anew in Newfoundland in his mid-30s after his emotionally abusive wife dies after trying to sell his 2 daughters into prostitution. Once there, he gets a job reporting for another newspaper and is assigned to the shipping news. As he, his daughters, and his aunt settle into their new lives, they meet many interesting characters and have equally interesting experiences, such as finding severed heads in suitcases, and later, the body it was once attached to, and near drownings, which seem to run in Coil's family. Ultimately, despite Coil's difficult life filled with loss, trauma, and mistreatment based on his appearance and below-average intelligence, he perseveres. Eventually finding success, happiness, and love, he marries Wavy, the woman once married to the severed head, and they essentially live happily ever after. So that's just a little overview. And then I thought it was also important to just briefly mention the symbols. So the epigraphs at the beginning of each chapter from the Ashley Book of Knots or Mariner's Dictionary or Quipus and Witches Knots, they foreshadow a character's storyline or mental state in the chapter to follow and or symbolize relationships. And I think they're really, really important. And they're also just really just clever and smart. And I just really like them. So, and there's one at the beginning of every chapter, as you guys know, but obviously we're not going to look at all of them. So these are just some of the important ones, I guess. So, chapter 3, the strangle knot. So, this represents the toxic relationship between Coil and Petal. So, that's a big chapter for them. I don't remember if that's the chapter where she dies, but that's just a big one for sort of their storyline. And then chapter 29, titled Alvin Yark. Below that, there's a picture of a bite knot, which means a wide coast and is the center or arc in a rope used in boat building. And this is the chapter when Yark builds Coil his new boat. So that's a big chapter for Coil, and just a just a big moment, I guess, for him. And then chapter 37, Sling Stones. These are used to anchor lobster pots, and it foreshadows Jack Buggin almost dying while lobstering, as his foot is trapped and he becomes anchored. So that's just a few of them. There's so many, and a lot of them are really, really clever, but just, couldn't mention all of them. And so then just briefly going back to the timeline, um, I just thought it was important to mention. In interviews, she often talks about how she considers her short stories to be greater accomplishments than her novels. And she's particularly proud of her 3 volumes of Wyoming stories. Close Range, she wrote in 1999, Bad Dirt in 2004, and Fine Just the Way It Is in 2008, which are about Wyoming's history, which she really, really loved. She lived there for a time. And she has also said, she's actually complained in interviews, that the problem with the Pulitzer, as well as other awards she's collected, is that they leave her with little time to write, because of the increased popularity, requests for interviews, and just visits. And so I think she's not only, more proud of some of her other works or short stories, but she's almost grown resentful, of the success of her novels, just because of, I guess, this sort of lifestyle change that has come with them. But anywho, that is Annie Proulx and the shipping news. Thanks for listening, guys.